Welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast, the photo imaging industry's leading news source. Here's your host, Gary Pageau.
The Dead Pixel Society podcast is brought to you by Media Clip, Photo Finale, and Advertech Printing. Hello again and welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. I'm your host, Gary Pageau, and today we're joined by a returning guest, Michael Rubin of Neomodern, who has pivoted his business into some interesting areas. And I thought we'd do kind of a catch-up podcast, talk to Michael about what Neomodern is today, what it's going to be, and where photography is going. Hey, Michael, how are you today?
I'm good, Gary. Good to see you.
So the last time we talked, you were in the middle of closing down the physical Neomodern retail store, which for those who don't remember, can you kind of describe what that business was?
Sure. And you just got to rub that in that it's dead, huh? Okay, no, I'll just joke. I'm joking with you. No, so it was a beautiful gallery space on Union Street in San Francisco, and people would come in with their smartphones, just regular people usually walking down the street. Our staff were all experts in Photoshop and Lightroom, and we would sit down with them, help them go through their pictures, Photoshop fix pictures that needed fixing, and then print them archivally. So we had a large printer, and then the special sauce was we would custom cut a mat for that print, sort of semi-custom frame it right there with them, and in 30 minutes they would walk out with the framed, beautiful archival print. And it was great. People loved it. I loved doing it. And I'd been spending my time sort of also moving that online. But then COVID hit and, things changed.
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of businesses, it was a challenge. You had high rent. You had a very, all that kind of thing. And I recommend people go back and listen to that podcast to cover the details on that, because that's not really what we want to talk about per se. You come from the fine art world, which I think is an interesting step for someone, to open a retail store and to talk to people about photography, because, you have a fine art background.
Well, I wanted to, it's my background, but I really have always spent my career interested in what I would call democratization, things that were historically limited, whether it was media, filmmaking, publishing, or ceramics, things that were limited by who could access them. You needed to be a professional or a very serious hobbyist, and technology has made it possible to democratize these things, to make it accessible to larger audiences at virtually the same kind of functionality and quality. So, my background was in fine art, in collecting and creating my own artwork, but I was really interested in connecting people with smartphones to the rest of the process. I've always felt that it really wasn't photography unless you printed it, and that was a component that was just being lost on all of the people with these really increasingly good phones, such that they wouldn't even get to benefit from that quality. I mean, imagine you get these 50, 100 megapixel images, but you're not going to really get to maximize the value of that on a phone or even on a desktop, but you can print it nicely. So I was trying to connect them to that functionality they may not have known they had. But yeah, the world intervened.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your democratization of technology concept, because you have an interesting background. You were in filmmaking at Lucasfilm in the editing world, which there's a book out there on that called Droid Maker, which I recommend people check out. And then you moved on there to Netflix and was kind of in the democratization of DVD delivery and streaming and those kind of things. And I'm not sure where ceramics fit into that, but I'm sure there's in there somewhere. So it was really, that period was a very interesting time in terms of technology, when you had the late 80s and 90s. It's just fascinating when you think about just the opportunity potential that digital had, which I don't think people really either grasp or appreciate today.
I got to say, having lived through it, it was a strange and kind of frustrating time. You could see, by the early 80s, it was pretty evident to people in industry what was happening with Moore's Law, in the early 80s, a hard disk, a 10 megabyte hard disk was like a washing machine. It was a big thing. And data was, we were dealing with, Word and Excel, like tiny data files.
Right.
And as the drives got larger, as the CPUs got faster, the opportunities to do more were increasing. And I was, part of helping Apple understand, like, wow, they were thinking, geez, if we want people to buy a high-powered CPU computer and a big old hard disk, they better be doing more than writing things and doing spreadsheets. They have to have images, they have to have video, or we're not going to sell these devices.
Right.
That was kind of the thinking at the time. And so I was early on interested in how you get the general public interested in shooting video. That was a really cryptic skill. And and we were imagining someday, like, everyone's going to be shooting video. That seems like a crazy thought.
Right.
And so from in the professional sense, in the film, for filmmakers and ENG news gatherers and stuff like that, it was frustrating because you were still you might be have some parts of the process that were able to be done digitally, and then other parts were being done sort of in the analog domain, and you were having to move between them. You might use an editing system to cut your TV show or your feature film, but in many cases it was still shot on celluloid. It was transferred to video. It was digitized into digital. You did the work, and then it had to come back out. Ultimately, on television, it would just come back out to video, or if it was for a theatrical release of a film, it had to go back and cut film. Like, that was a really arduous process. So we could see that digital was going to get better, and like in a few years everything will be digital. But those transition years were, somewhere between 10 and, depending how you define it, there was a very confusing 10, almost 20 years of transitioning. And
for, to some extent, there were so many limitations because of the technology at this time that it presented all kinds of interesting problems. Like, for example, the first batch of digital cameras didn't even have a processing power to process the raw image into a JPEG. Remember, you had actually connected to a computer to process the quote unquote finished file, right?
Yeah, I would actually go back. I'm your age, but like, there was actually, before there was these compression schemes, there was just image files, and they were enormous. And the question was, is JPEG gonna, like, can you compress it without screwing it up? It's a lossy compression, and compare that to lossless compression schemes. And there were a lot more focus on file formats. Like, did you want it to be a TIFF, or did you want it to be this because the image was better? And so, you know what? This is sort of a digression, but one of the startups I did when I left Lucasfilm, I joined a startup that was in the digital audio space called Sonic Solutions.
Sure.
And it was eventually sold off. But Sonic Solutions pioneered the CD pre-mastering technologies. And the thing that was interesting about the business model, and it kind of highlights this era, was that in 1987, which was the year we sort of founded that thing, there was every single recording ever made by humanity was analog, right? There's a tape of it somewhere. Sure. And starting around 87, every new recording was being done digitally.
Correct.
So you've got a finite, very large body of stuff that has to kind of move from analog to digital. And by our calculations, when we started the company, if we worked at full tilt, using our workstations, it might be 5 years of lucrative work, but it would end, and that's what we did. Like, we started a company, we basically pre-mastered every single thing from Neil Armstrong landing on the moon to, Lionel Hampton and Louis Armstrong playing in the RCA Bluebird stuff. Like, all of those recordings had to be somehow converted over. Right. And then you ended up and so I think about that a lot. We, at the time, then, while we were in the middle of that process, we're doing the pioneering work in what became DVDs.
Sure.
And then that had a new opportunity of pre-mastering DVDs in the same way. Every old film needed to go through that process, but new ones eventually would be shot digitally. So that's
what does pre-mastering mean for those who don't know?
Pre-mastering in audio in particular is basically getting the audio file ready for reproduction in the new format. So for instance, you might come in with basically the only master you had for, we did all these Disney recordings. They only had the optical track from the film. Like they had no more master tapes. So we had to ingest the optical tracks into digitize them, but they're band limited and they had lots of noise. And so our Sonic Solutions technology invented denoising and declicking, depopping, all that stuff. And you could decide how much you want to kind of clean it out. So I did a lot of albums. I did some Grateful Dead albums. I did, Barbra Streisand albums. These were things that came in analog, and you had to sit down and listen to them like a millisecond at a time and look at the waveforms and decide, is it clean enough? Is it too clean? And that was a manual task in the 1988,
Did you get anything that you had to listen to that you were thinking, they're not paying me enough for this?
Well, I will. At the time I wasn't a big Grateful Dead fan, and I was responsible for Europe 72 and Working Man's Dead, and I was pre-mastering those. And I think they gave it to me because you actually, when you're on headphones listening to the music, you don't want to be listening to the music. You don't want to just be settling in like, I love this song.
Yeah.
And so they purposely put me on there, but there was a song or a track called Feedback. And I just remember going through that a second at a time, and I didn't like it. I didn't get it. And that was, I had met the Grateful Dead in that era. And that was the only thing that kind of got me through it, was thinking about, well, they're cool guys. They're historically, they're historically important. And this is important. There was a story, I know this is so off track, but when there was a guy named Bruce Botnick, he had recorded the Doors. They'd made a film from the Hollywood. They'd filmed and recorded the Doors at the Hollywood Bowl in the late 60s.
Right.
And Jim Morrison's microphone had a loose cable. So when he moved around, it cracked and popped horribly, and it was unfixable. And the engineer, the guy who had the recording, they felt like they couldn't release the movie if they didn't have the tracks, and they were hamstrung. Right. And every couple of years from the 1970 to 1987, he would take it to engineers, to scientists, to see if there was anything they could do, and no one could fix this thing. And he showed up at Sonic Solutions in 87 with the Doors from the Hollywood Bowl and said, is there anything you could do? And we fixed it. We cleaned it. And that movie and the CD released that year. Nice. And this guy, like, I think he visibly wept. Like, it was an amazing moment to finally be able to release that thing. So that's the joys of technology. That's what that era was like for me. I enjoyed that time.
Yeah. Back in the photography world in that era, we were dealing with the photo CD, the Kodak photo CD system. And with the PMA at the time, that was a big focus for the industry, because you had all of this analog input, right? This film, and it was how to get it digitized. Mm-hmm. And it really kind of pioneered that sort of hybrid workflow idea, where we're going to take this analog process and then get it digital and then make physical prints or some kind of weird thing. And a lot of that work was the archival work. You had people setting up photo CD workstations, which at the time were running on Spark workstations, and they cost like $250,000 and I think 1992 dollars, and the proprietary format and all this other fun stuff. And
but I think about this in terms of photography, because when I talk to certainly older photographers today, you have that same situation, which is, yes, some photographers are still shooting analog, and that will always persist. But by and large, photography today is digital going forward. So all new pictures come in digitally. They are generally time stamped. They're possibly GPS stamped. But you have this body of work, every old photograph either you've ever taken or the history of photography, that are still analog. Yeah. And people want to see them in the digital domain. And some things will never be transferred over. You'll never see them on a computer or maybe someday
Well,
they
I mean,
will.
and that's, one of the segments that, read the newsletter is kind of those digitization businesses, right? Because you've got the send away people like Scan My Photos and iMemories and Yes Video, and those are great. Then there's, retail space people who, like your local retailer, you can drop things off and they scan it and preserve it and maybe spot it and all that. And then there's people who try and do it themselves.
Right.
And so I've talked to people in that market, and they think there's a lot of life left in that market, because
there may be.
It's because it's, if every household has 10,000 images, think how many households there are.
Right.
You have a few more because
it's big, but it's big, but it's finite.
Right. Oh yeah, it's definitely got a time when it's yeah.
And you also might in the first. It might be an 80-20 rule. Like in the first bunch of years, you get most of your stuff in that's important that you care about, and everybody does their important stuff. And then there's just a long tail of like things, if we have time, we should get that shot. I'm not putting all of my pictures in, but I'll get that one done. Feel like, and I've been doing a little consulting for a couple companies that do this kind of thing, that are interested in helping people with their photos. Sure. And I just, I wonder, sometimes you got to balance your energy, your attention between the people who are coming in with a pile that are going to be hard to manage and get them into a computer, and not making a product that's too designed for that, versus making something that handles like people walking in today where they've got a smartphone and everything's already digital, and getting it digitized is not even part of the workflow. That's a weird thing to even ask about, right?
Well, like I was going back to was, at some point, there's going to be generational challenge where people won't care about grandpa's photos or whatever, So I think, like you said, there's a finite life to this.
Or they're taking a picture with their phone. Like they just don't care. It's in a scrapbook. They'll just take a picture with their phone and it's fine. They don't need to do any fancy scanning.
There are apps for that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about that sort of 90s, 2000 era, which was sort of a strange intersection of sort of the, California hippie aesthetic that kind of drove Apple and HP and those things. And it kind of was moving kind of almost into the corporate world as digital took over a lot of industries. And as it took over photography, what were you doing photographically at that time? Because you were kind of in the audio movie space, but you were still photographing, right?
I was, but I was still photographing on film. I found in the late 90s, digital cameras irked me. I didn't like, they were both overpriced and underqualityed for what they were.
So and you never had a Sony Mavica, right?
Oh no, actually I take that back. I had a Sony Mavica recording on a floppy disk. But I was, but that further in sort of, it pushed me to this feeling like, not yet. That just sucked. Like where I've got my Olympus OM2 and a roll of Triax, and I know what the picture will look like. It'll look great. And I know how to develop it. Now we're in that transition over those years. So it's slowly getting harder and harder to get our film developed. The places were closing and printed was, you could go to a photomat and get a bunch of, 3.5 by 5s, but it affected us slowly, but I stayed on film. I really pushed back against digital, even into the beginnings of the 2000s. I mean, the writing was on the wall, but I was more interested in that era with the filmmaking stuff, with the democratization of video, where we had mini DV, which was a tape format, a linear format, but it was still digital. And it was of a quality that was arguably approaching broadcasting qualities of shooting videos, which meant you could go to a store, get a camera. If you knew what you were doing, you could make video and audio as good as professionals were doing. And of course,
and that was the era the video toaster was coming out. So you had desktop editing happening.
You had all the desktop revolutions, desktop publishing and desktop editing. And so that was my focus, photography but Photoshop in that era. I mean, I had the version 3. I mean, I had the early versions of all of these pieces of software, but I didn't think they were either ready for prime time or actually supplanted what I wanted from them for myself.
Right. Right.
Like I would use Photoshop if I was doing some pre-press for a photo that was going in a book I was working on. Like that's when
Right.
you'd use Photoshop, but I didn't just routinely use Photoshop. It was a special tool, like a graphic design tool. You just use it to prep.
So moving forward, you've moved. Like we mentioned before, Neomodern doesn't exist as a retail store, so you've kind of taken the Neomodern aesthetic and transported it, if you will.
Yes.
And so where are you physically now, and what are you doing?
Well, I had to close the gallery, and my staff and the process I kind of implanted into another kind of frame photo place in San Francisco, Photograph and Frame. So you can get that service still sort of in San Francisco. Not sort of, you can totally get that service in San Francisco. I had enough sort of traction on the IP that I didn't want to just chuck the neomodern.com. And I was transitioning more into teaching. Like I have a kind of a philosophical feeling about photography.
Right,
and
which
so,
we want to touch on.
Yeah, so during COVID, during the sort of sheltering in place and lockdown, I started writing a book about sort of my philosophies of photography. I've been taking pictures as an amateur for almost 50 years. And I felt that professional photographers have a lot to teach us, but in a world of people who are walking around with their smartphones and taking pictures that way and who have no ambitions to be professional, I kept feeling that my experience as a non-professional photographer was possibly more instructive. I'm a person who grew up walking around with a camera and taking pictures for my own satisfaction, basically. So what does 50 years of that look like? So I wrote this book. So I wrote this text, and I just kind of discovered this connection to the Zen arts, which was not something was a natural inclination for me, but I kept bumping into discussions of haiku or discussions of ikebana, which is the flower arranging. And I realized, I think there's something here. I think there's a connection. The more I would read about the Zen arts and the more I studied it, you could almost substitute the word photography for whatever art I was looking at.
Right.
And whether I'm talking about wabi-sabi or origami or something else. And if you put the word photography in that sentence, I felt like that was describing my own photographic work. So I wrote this book, and I was going to publish it. I've been working with a publisher, but it was a relatively short book, and most publishers don't really like very short books. They can't charge enough to make enough money to make it worth their while, and they wanted me to make it longer, flesh it out, and I kind of liked the elegance of a short, elegant little book.
Yeah, so I mean, it's sort of the haiku idea, right?
Yeah,
almost say it all in 3 lines, right?
Exactly. If you could say it in 3 lines, why would you say it in 50, 100 pages, right?
Because you're not in publishing.
That's because I'm not in, and because I'm not trying to make money from it in that way, the way a publisher might. So I had this, and then by coincidence, I was connected to the Sante Fe Photographic Workshops, these distinguished group of, phenomenal instructors, great courses. Sure. And they decided that I could teach this new curriculum. Let's see how it goes. Like you never really know if you got it in the right order or if you need to expand on some areas and condense other areas. It was sort of academic during COVID. And so starting this month, I've been teaching Sante Fe workshop, and it's called Photographic Haiku. And it's letting me work out the sort of the details in the curriculum. And it's so far going great, and it's fun. And I think that's going to be an ongoing course with SFW.
So for the average snap shooter who's got their smartphone and then they realize, oh my God, they may not even know that they've got this, raw format in their camera, and, they don't, but if you're moving forward with this idea of the democratization idea, are you really talking about maybe the democratization of visual expression, perhaps?
Yeah, well, it's a kind of visual literacy. But the thing is that, it's so easy to take a picture today that I I think what constitutes a good picture changes. I think what people want from their photography as consumers is sometimes different from what professionals are going for.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we have an obligation to make each of those pictures better because there's so many pictures. We don't just
But you hate the rule of thirds.
I do hate the rule of, you know what? I was just starting to write an essay about the rule of thirds. Yes, it's bullshit, but I think I think I can modulate that a little bit. It isn't bullshit. It isn't bullshit. It is, here's what I'll say about the rule of thirds. And I know you're just joking with me, but I think it's a specific case. It's like Newtonian physics. It's not totally wrong. It just applies in a very limited kind of universe. And I don't think it's the best way to teach it. And I don't think it helps people because I think the people teaching it don't understand it well enough. So they just recite this Newtonian physics principle and it sort of works sometimes. And then the minute it doesn't work, they just say disregard it. But I believe there's an Einsteinian physics principle, which is actually under this that is right. And the rule of thirds is just kind of a specific case of this broader understanding of photographic composition. And that's what I try to get to in the course of how we're really composing pictures.
So it's sort of like the idea that, on a basic physical level, light behaves a certain way. It can be a particle, but then sometimes it's also a wave, right? But most people don't care because they're just they turn on a light and it turns on. But if you want to get deeper, you can get deeper.
I would say it's more like 1/2 mv squared. Kinetic energy is half the mass and the square of the velocity. That's how you calculate that. But if velocity goes up to, the speed of light, the 1/2 of mass doesn't matter. And the more universal case is mass, E equals mc squared is a more generalized case of 1/2 mv squared. I don't even know how we got down this, but
I'm going to have to put a physics disclaimer.
I barely understand my college physics. So, but in that way, photographic composition, I believe that there is a center weight kind of composition where the mass is in the center. And then I think there's an off center mass composition. And to do that well, you need to have sort of a balancing force on the other side, both physical, visual, emotional, that balances it out. It is not about it being at a third. It's not like on a third line. I think some people say it's on that line. Some people say it's on that 1/3 quadrant. And the truth is, in a rectangular in any shaped frame, it's not in the center or it is in the center. Right. And I think it's good for beginners to remember that they can push a subject out of the center. And so maybe it's okay to tell them to put it at a third, but you're not really teaching them why they're doing or what the point of doing that is. And I can show when you look at things like Ikebana, which is about these balances and harmonies of objects that have different weights and relationships, it speaks a lot better to what you're doing in that frame than shoving a subject to the side, when the truth is, I mean, honestly, how often do you have a single subject in a neutral frame that you can just shove it to the side? You've got a series of things in a frame that you're trying to arrange inside this rectangle. One of them might be the most important and others are less important, but you can't put your finger always on what the subject is. The subject's everything in the frame.
Right. It is one of those things where if you just scroll through Instagram, and I know you're not a big Instagram guy, but you see people using technology, portrait mode or, things like that. They don't know really what they're doing in the sense, I mean, technically they don't know what they're doing, right? They just know they want a portrait and they want to blur the background, and they may have. So do you think that technology is leading that, or people always had the propensity for visual literacy, if you will, and technology is making it easier? Because I'm kind of wrestling with, is technology, people be taking this many portraits if it was as easy with film or whatever? And would they know enough to, open the aperture or close the aperture to get the effect they want? Or is it just technology's kind of replacing their brain at that point?
I mean, I think technology is replacing their brain. I think that it's like my car. There was a time when you could like you needed to know how your car worked and and it was easy. You could open the hood and to pull on this thing or pull that thing. And it was logical. You could see it. And
very much child of the 80s thing, remember? Yeah.
And it would hard to consider yourself a car person if you didn't know how all that stuff worked. But nowadays, not only do you not need to know how it works, but you'd be hard pressed to figure out how it works or be able to fix it.
And you're almost discouraged.
Yeah, and you're
to
almost
work on your own car because you'll probably void the warranty if you actually open your hood.
Which means more people can kind of feel like they're car people because they can do and really enjoy their cars. It does all that stuff automatically and they don't have to shift or whatever. And, you know, a lot of purists will argue that they're missing half the joy of driving, but they're finding other joys. It is, I will say though, it's one of the reasons why my photographic workshops are completely outside of technical discussion. Like you don't need to, I mean, while I want them to understand the ideas of f-stop and shutter speed and things like that. Increasingly, the cameras will get better and better at making decisions and helping people do that, which is wonderful. What it won't do for them is A, compose their picture, or B, choose their subject matter. And I think that's why I like having an underlying philosophy of the photography, because if you do those other things the camera can't do for you, the non-technical stuff, the human stuff, that's where you can grow as a photographer, where I think a lot of professionals hit a plateau. I think they would be hard pressed to say how they would get better at what they do. But if you talk to a haiku poet, they spend their whole life in the practice of these haikus and whipping them out and trying to see if they can nail it and get a perfect one before they die. And I think that's a better model for how professionals might want to think about their photography to avoid that sort of burnout. You know, I've talked to Instagram guys who have millions of followers and they don't know they don't even know why. They don't really seem to make a lot of money on it.
Yeah.
Their pictures all are getting sort of boring and looking sort of alike. And I feel for them. They got into it. They got early success, but they don't have anything they're pushing up against as far as what the photography is. They might go to more and more advanced places. Let's climb Everest and take pictures. Let's go to Bali. But the truth, and you know this, is that photography is less about the thing you're shooting and more about how you're seeing it. And you can take beautiful pictures and have a great photographic experience going nowhere, just at home or wandering through your town, documenting your life.
Yeah, I mean, you did that whole series of portraits in your own apartment with you know, the same sort of space. It was the same sort of idea where you didn't go on location. People came to you and you shot the you know, moving furniture around and looking at the light and that kind of thing. So
that was cool. And that was an exercise. I mean, for those who aren't following it, it was kind of a nude process. That's what I was trying to do. Is
you were shooting nudes. You were not nude when you took the picture.
That's correct. I was dressed. The people who showed up were just friends. There was not a single model among them. They're just people in an apartment, but nothing changed in this apartment. It was just an empty room. The light was the light of the day. The camera was always the same. And the only thing that really changed was the light and the person. And my feeling was, if you can't tell the pictures apart, if they start getting boring or repetitive, you're done. And the work as a photographer for me was, can I keep innovating in a space where there's increasingly more constraint, because I've shot it a ton and I shot for 7 years. I shot hundreds and hundreds of friends and it never got old. Like by the last pictures I took, they were very different from the first pictures I took. And it's kind of, and that's photography for me.
You know, let's talk a little bit about that word you just mentioned, because I think it really goes to something I want to touch on, is the word constraints. Because really having digital kind of gives you the have limitless opportunities, limitless chances to experiment, to play, or whatever. And it produces a lot of crap.
Yeah.
In the sense that because you can take someone's portrait and make it look like a cartoon does not necessarily mean you're either A, saying something, or B, doing it well. So it sounds to me like where you're going is sort of kind of embracing the idea of a constraint
Oh, I would go beyond that. I would go beyond saying embrace constraint. I would say that it's required. Constraints are required, and part of the Zen art approach that I'm laying out is establishing your constraints.
But that's up to you as the photographer.
One establishes his or her own constraints,
right.
Because pushing up against those constraints is sort of the joy of creativity.
I will only shoot at 1/30th of a second.
Yeah, no. I mean, you laugh, but there are people who say, I will shoot one picture a day. One picture a day. Like, that's a constraint. Or for me, I would say, I will not crop. I won't crop. If I have to crop the picture, to make it better, who am I pleasing? For me, I'm trying to compose in frame. I'm trying to dynamically do this thing. And if I get it, that's great. If I fail, I don't really have an objective to cheat at it. Sometimes I do, but I don't feel good about it. Right. I recognize the difference between something that I had to crop a little bit and I at least keep the same aspect ratio. So things sort of feel the same if I had to crop it. But those are arbitrary constraints. Like in haiku, many haiku people use this 5-7-5 syllable thing. Like, if you tell me that I can, and honestly, many haiku masters have thrown that out, and I can go into that some other time. But let's just say you're sticking with the 5-7-5. If someone said 5-7-5 is a haiku, but actually you make it as long as you want, it's like, well, that's not fun. Like, the fun is trying to just do a lot with very little. So for photography, I encourage the students in my class to come up with what constraints you want to be working at. Now, you can change them anytime, but have constraints. And the process of photography is not just taking a picture. It's not pushing a button and pointing a camera. It is selecting one of the things that you've taken. And that selection process is non-trivial. But weeding out all the other crap and getting down to one picture is another constraint. Like, that's an arbitrary constraint. I could just give you 100 pictures and say, hey, there's a good one in there. But that's abdicating my job as a photographer.
Right. So is printing would you consider that a constraint? Because I know you're a big fan of the print, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, is because I do think there's a continued interest and a continued almost resurgence these days in print.
Well,
as a valuable medium.
Well, yes, I think that, as I said, it's not photography if you don't print it. It is art. It's a lot of things if you don't print it. And it's great to go through the process of weeding out your crap and sharing them and putting them on your Facebook page and all that. But photography is a graphic art, and like origami or even wabi-sabi, it can't exist in the virtual world. It's part of printing. Besides physically determining how this thing will be experienced, which is as important as taking it in the first place. I choose how dark this background will be. I choose that the frame is exactly like this. The minute I put it online, I don't control those things at all. And people are seeing it on different devices at different sizes for different amounts of time. And I just feel like that's part of the process that I can't give up. I must pick how I want you to see this. And so I will print it so there is one excellent version of this thing. And more importantly, I've got a printer, I've got resources and inks and paper sitting here, and I go look at the pictures I took yesterday and I'm about to print, and I look at it and I think, nah, I'm not going to print that. That's not good enough. Either it's not good enough, or I don't know why I would print it. I'm not going to sell that, and I don't want to put it up. And that means it is a higher bar for our work, because certain works make that cut. I want to see that big. I want to put that on my wall. I want to stare at it a lot. And
do you print all of your own work, or do you have a preferred lab?
I print my own work, and that's what Neomodern was. It was also a photographic printing place.
Sure, yeah.
I think that it's great. I've experienced what it's like to have a terrific printer, because not everybody knows what a great print looks like or knows how to make the technology deliver that great print. And there are people who do, print masters of various colors all over the world, who are just great at printing. And there's nothing.
Yeah, I mean, even the best photographers, the classic photographers, a lot of them didn't print their own work because they had master printers who would execute what they wanted for them.
Absolutely. And Ansel Adams, who was like one of the preeminent printers of his day, invented the zone system, and he had assistants who he would train to print his work. And they became this body of unbelievably good printers. John Sexton, Ted Orland. These were Ansel Adams' assistants, and they, Perkle Jones, all great photographers in their own right, but they also were master printers. And I always thought that, like, if you've got to, either you need to learn how to become a great printer or have a relationship with someone who's a great printer. And that relationship is a important one. George Tice, who is a phenomenal photographer, is well respected as one of the great printers. So that's a thing. So I think that people who are interested in photography, who love photography, really need to both own prints and, either buy other people's prints or see their own work printed. For all these reasons, for the vetting, it's just a higher bar. And I think finally, because the only way I ever really know if a picture is any good is that you stare at it a lot. And I don't just mean you put it on your screen for 10 seconds and you're like, yeah, it's good. I mean, it's on your wall and you see it every day. And after 2 years, when you go by it, does it still make you stop and look at it and think, God, that was awesome. I love that picture. Or do you start getting bored? Like, it's like, I liked it. I don't know why I liked it before, but and you can't get to that point until you've got a print in front of you.
It's funny. This was making me think, the trendy thing now amongst the youngsters is, is film photography, right? And it kind of goes back to what we were talking earlier about hybrid. A lot of them are shooting film, having someone else process it, and then having the images scanned onto a disc, which they may or may not even print, which is kind of, to me, they're kind of missing that last to some extent. It's sort of like, oops, we're not quite there yet.
I get it. I mean, there's something about the look of a Polaroid, the look of Tri-X.
Well, yeah, Polaroid's something else completely.
Right. But the idea that, when Instagram came out, they had lots of sort of faux filters that would make it look like a physical print was scanned at some level. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that people respond to that wabi-sabi nature, to the subtle imperfections, the effects of time, all that stuff. So I think when people shooting with film or a pinhole camera or a 4x5 or whatever it is, they want to, they like the constraint. It limits what they can shoot. It creates a certain kind of real look. Right. And then they want to get it digital because that's where it's easiest to manage and manipulate. And you can still make a print from that. It's funny. I've looked at digital things I've shot that I'm looking at putting back on negative so that I can print them as a silver print. Like how ass backwards is that? And then there's other people shooting on film who are scanning it into digital and printing on an inkjet printer. Like, so I don't think anyone would have calculated that. I don't know how big those markets are. I mean, there's always going to be sort of a niche of people who either still shoot film. I used to say this back when celluloid was going away for feature films, which was, everyone's going to be shooting and delivering on digital, but there'll always be like that class, the high class of people like Spielberg and Scorsese, I thought, who would still demand their stuff be shot on celluloid and projected on a wall, in a theater, and they would have the clout to do it. But I thought that it would become like opera, or we're going to the symphony. Like you could still see projected film, but it would be very rarefied. It would be a very special, different kind of event. And places that handled that would be not the same as the regular theater where you just go to watch your movies.
And then there was The Irishman, where'd that come from? That's another discussion. Anyway, but I just find that kind of interesting because it sort of talks about the flexibility and fluidity of photography, that you kind of have these options, right? You can start analog, go through a chemical process. Even if you want, you can even provide instructions on, hey, I want you to pull the process or push it or whatever. to achieve a certain effect in negative, and then have the image scanned, do something with it additionally, and then and go somewhere else. But I think, again, I'm not hearing from a lot of my friends in the industry where they're seeing a lot of those images being printed. I hear a lot of, the excitement of analog is sort of in the capture side of it, where you're I'm being so old school. It's like I'm getting out the turntable and listening to my Grateful Dead.
Well, people like different parts of photography, right? I mean, I see people who have a tripod and a big wooden box camera, and they like the experience of having like 5 plates, and they're gonna like be very measured at what they shoot. Like that's a discipline and that's a constraint, of course. And they like the experience. Like that's fun for them. Maybe they're not interested in going into a dark room and smelling like Dektol and
well, who doesn't though?
Well, yeah, I like Dektol. I like that smell. That brings me back. It's like that olfactory memory is very exciting for me. The toxic.
Should come up with a cologne.
Yeah, look at both of us. Like that's what happened to our hair. Like I'm certain bathing in toxic waste for most of our early puberty has ruined us. But I think that people are drawn to, there are photographers who love going into the studio and setting up the lights and working with the model and shooting 8,000 pictures and going into Photoshop and finding the right one. Like that's something they love about photography, and delivering that perfect picture, going into Photoshop and making it perfect. None of that interests me, but it doesn't mean I don't like photography or I don't even think that they're good photographer. That's just a different kind of photography, a different aspect of it. So I think that that's one of the cool things about picture taking, is that there's so many capture ways, distribution ways, ways of experiencing it. But the biggest market, the biggest body of people are people shooting with their phones. They don't generally print. They're not connected to that. They generally don't know anything or self-identify as a photographer even.
Right.
And I think it's an opportunity to not get all of them, but get some number of them to understand what people for 100 years have been doing. When you only get one picture, or how do you make a good picture that really matters, that you'll actually care about in 20 years and not just buried in your 18 terabyte drive or something,
Right. Yeah, that was, I don't know if you've seen, we had a item in the newsletter recently about somebody, I think it was Fuji, did a study in the UK about British people during the age of COVID, how they were kind of going back to their printed pictures, and really felt they were getting, because they were stuck at home, and they kind of reconnected with their analog pictures. I do think, kind of bringing it into the current world, that there has been a greater appreciation of maybe family, friends, etc., because you've had them removed from you in some ways, and photography is one way of reconnecting with those your family and friends.
I agree. It's super fun. I just had a reunion with my college freshman dorm, and people were snapping pictures of things in their scrapbooks and sharing them, and there was a lot of
virtual or physical.
Virtual is a Zoom thing, but it was cool. Like we were actually noting that there was a relatively small number of photos that even all of us together might have. I probably had the most because I actually walked around with a camera back then, but relatively few pictures. Trying to imagine today kids where they've got hours of footage, thousands and thousands of pictures. I'm curious what their looking back experiences will be like.
Well, they're going to have AI going to come back and fix all that stuff. No, seriously, that's going to go back and it's going to choose the images and the best or whatever. That'll be driven a lot of that. But like you said, there's going to be a big gap in the early digital where that stuff wasn't time stamped correctly or had geolocation or the facial recognition doesn't work right. But I don't know if that's a technological solution or not.
I don't, one of the company that I'm most working with, and I'm not going to mention them yet, but like designing a new way for people to experience their pictures, right. Like a fully different way than Google Photos or Facebook or Flickr or anything like that. And I'm really excited about the sort of opportunity to change the way people think about visual imagery, experience their past through this body of data, basically.
So as we kind of bring this to a close, I want to talk a little bit about the feedback you're getting from your students to your ideas. What are you kind of gleaning from them?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. The course isn't totally over, so they're not going to be critical yet.
Mhm.
But I think that they're getting it. I think they understand. Uh, it seems to me that they're resonating with these ideas. And in some ways, I'm just putting words and structure on something that all photographers do anyway.
Right. That's kind of where I was going with that.
But it has enough of a difference that where people are floundering in their photography and just taking pictures of leaves as they walk around their neighborhood and not, sure where to go with this. They just want to take pictures of nicer leaves. I don't know. To talk about the difference in composition of objects that aren't moving and objects that are in motion, how you compose a picture when everything in the frame is in motion. How do you decide what you take pictures of? Like, what is the litmus test for that? Are all pictures equally good, or are there actually quantifiable ways to describe good pictures and bad pictures? And just to give you a taste of that, the things that people resonate the most with is, I have a couple continuum that people use as we discuss pictures, and one of them is from it's obviousness, from obvious to cryptic. Those are the two ends of the line, and somewhere between, like, obvious might be, here's a picture of a stapler. There's the stapler. What is it? That's a stapler. To cryptic, where it's those games where you're like, what is this? And you're staring at it and you can't figure it out, or why it was what's going on. Sure. Somewhere in the middle there is a moment that haiku describes where something goes from not quite understanding it till you get it. Right. It's a tiny switch, and there's a moment of delight when that happens. Now, if it's too far out, they won't get it, or it'll take too long and they won't last. And if it's too close in, it's too obvious. It's like a beautiful sunset. Okay, yes, it's beautiful. That's easy. It's colorful. It's happy. I look at it and it's like a sugary, satisfying drink. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just super far on the obvious side. Right. But if you push it in a little bit farther, it's like, where's that point for you? And I think the students, like, that's one thing we talk about in class, and it's something we learn from haiku in practice. But now, if you know that one thing and think about things in that term, you go and you see a dog sitting on the street and you think it's an adorable dog, and you take the picture, and now you ask yourself, well, that's obvious. How can I ratchet it back a little bit? So it's still fun. It's still delightful. It's still the dog, but it's not quite so this far on the continuum. Right. And there's lots of ways we talk about doing that. And then there's other issues of composition, other things that go on. But that's just one of the things that I think the students really resonate with. And it's a new idea in terms of the metrics we use as we talk about photography. And there's a handful of those. And they all come from Zen. They come from the Zen arts. And soon people will be able to experience this in a physical book. I hope so. Yes, that's the plan, to get that out in 2021. There you go. Well, we're in 2021 now, so hopefully by the end of the year, the world will be in a better place and people can appreciate your book. I'm hoping all of 2021, it puts us all in a better place, and the book is just one part of everyone getting out finally and so people can go to, I think, neomodern.com to see what you're working on, and the next season of Everyday Photography Everyday podcast is going to start again soon, correct? When I get to Santa Fe, yes, it will re-kick in. And there's links to the Santa Fe Workshops on the Neomodern site if you don't want to just go straight to the Santa Fe Workshop site. And it's we'll get back into this photographic evangelism in 2021 in a serious way. Well, thank you, Michael, for your time. We've had a great discussion, and I encourage everyone to check out neomodern.com and Everyday Photography Every Day, and we'll see you another time.
Thank you for listening to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. Read more great stories and sign up for the newsletter at www.thedeadpixelssociety.com.